Good evening. I'm Mary Warnament, William D. Hacker, Head of Reader Services here, and I begin with a reminder. Please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices that make noise. And another reminder as well, the way that you came into the building is not the way that you go out in the event of an emergency, the very unlikely event of an emergency. You will exit either to your front, to the left, through the newspaper reading room, or behind you, just beyond the restrooms. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 2014 annual Torrence C. Harder Endowed Lecture, established 15 years ago. This evening's speaker is Gretchen Henderson, who teaches in the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop. She was the 2012-2013 Catherine Mooney Fellow at the Boston Athenaeum. Before that, she was Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at MIT and a Research Fellow at Harvard. She's the author of 2 novels, a volume on music and literature, and a poetry chapbook. Her award-winning and clearly diverse writings have appeared in a wide variety of journals and anthologies. She recently curated an interview series for Plowshares on people of the book. Gretchen explores the physicality and the idea of the book. She provokes us to rethink what we may assume and what we may think we know. Obviously, this is an ideal place for her to consider both traditional and newer forms of the book. She contemplates the book as a kind of body, and if that's the case, I would speculate we could call Gretchen a book, and she would be an open book, inspiring creative efforts in others and creating human linkages among all of her readers. I know her table of contents would have a dedication page and acknowledgments, and I also don't doubt that her pages would bear much marginalia, unless in a library, in which case I'm sure that we would see many due dates stamped in the back. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Mary, for that very kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be back at the Athenaeum. This was kind of a home away from home last year, thanks to the Mary Catherine Mooney Fellowship. And I'm also really want to extend my thanks to Torrence Harder for endowing this lecture, and Lauren Harder, his daughter, who will be here tonight, to Victoria O'Malley, who helped with my arrangements to come out here, Amanda Pirogue and Brad Curry, sitting up there for their technical expertise to help this all happen, and just to the many fine librarians who inspired me during my time here. So the event description includes some questions that I'll spend this evening unpacking, and Mary's already referred to some of them, but I'll just put them back in the room. How do we classify books in changing material and digital environments? How do we engage readers and students in shifting reading and writing practices? How do our bodies make and unmake books? I'm investigating these questions through a long-term project called the Galerie de Difformité, that is a book growing outside of its inscribed bounds, deforming in the hands of readers to create a new kind of gallery and notion of the book. To start, I'd like to show a short film, which is the novel's quote-unquote anti-trailer, the opposite of a movie trailer, to give a sense of the underlying plot, and then afterwards speak about the larger architecture of the project that unpacks some of these questions related to unwriting the book as a body, and the body as a book.
Imagine a grid, or something with lines that cross and hatch, with openings that signify exits and egresses between rooms and corridors. The rooms resemble odd boxes that could grow three-dimensionally in another context, fronted by neoclassical columns or brightly colored tubes. But this two-dimensional page remains blank, apart from a smattering of labels and thumbnails. To another mind, this map wouldn't appear minimalist, but palatial, high and wide enough to shrink us down to size. I can barely imagine that cavern, glowing, resonant with echoes and with ceiling edged by sky. Through shadows, bodies come into focus, asymmetric and angled, scattered in all directions. The nearest stands armless and cloth-draped. Her nudity is not severe as her severed foot, torn nipples, stubbed nose. She wants for bandages, surrounded by other broken bodies whose pallor is pearlescent. Another body bends into focus, then another, and another, until we are surrounded by an army lacking heads and hands, cocks and breasts, a torso here and there, a pile of arms and legs. Each body softens as stone, lost in graceful gazes. Behind them, a wall materializes from whiteness, hung with frames. Within those frames, more bodies appear, fractured figures, penitent postulants, beckoning fingers. A torso twists. A set of eyes follows our steps. Again and again, I've tried to imagine what the creator of Galerie de Difformité envisioned. I am not she, but am offering this volume as testament to her work. Gloria Hayes died before completing her enterprise, but in the last 2 years of her life, she shared with me a glimpse of her vision. We met under strange circumstances. She was the only child of my grandfather's mistress, from a second family that he kept secret for decades. Only as an adult did I learn of her and sought her halfway across the country. She was a petite woman who stayed virtually housebound after the deaths of her husband, a Vietnam veteran, and only son with Down syndrome. Adulthood brought Gloria a rare disease which left her arm crippled. What might have weighed down another person, however, seemed to bring her lightness. Something about her was sprite-like. Her reverence for learning rivaled only what I remembered of my grandfather, a renowned scholar of medieval studies. Gloria never completed college or her studies of music, but her bungalow brimmed with books. She was a conundrum, homely on the surface, seemingly serious, with a wit that made me laugh when I least expected. I remember her vividly, more than acquaintances who I've known half of my life. On that single occasion when we met in person, she pieced together part of me that I hadn't known was missing. Much of that experience and this book is owed to a single bone. Gloria's bone was a relic, small enough to fit in a hand. It was shaped as a quill. What was most curious about its form was a heart-shaped hole near the sword-shaped nib. Toward the end of our visit, Gloria revealed that the bone with a heart-shaped hole was a gift from her father, my grandfather, from one of his sabbaticals to Italy. She said that it was a xiphoid process, part of the sternum. It wasn't an original bone, her father had claimed, but rather a model fashioned by hand as a quill in the 18th century by a British fraternal organization with the endearing name of Ye Ugly Face Club to record their members' fantastic physiognomic features. Perhaps even more fantastic than that fact, the original bone was thought to have been extracted from the corpse of Beatrice Portinari of Dantean fame. Like families save and bequeath engagement rings and Bibles, this bone seemed destined to be passed, literally and legendarily, on to the next of kin. And when we said our goodbyes, Gloria asked for my address and said to expect something in the mail. For each month thereafter, for 2 years, We maintained a correspondence that has been one of the richest and rarest experiences of my life. It wasn't what might be expected, not any sentimental laugh and cry cascade of revelations. Instead of letters, Gloria sent me segments of something she referred to as her gallery, this gallery. It was a project that she had started after her husband and son died, when she lived alone for the first time in her life. She called me her subscriber. I didn't know what she meant until I received the first installment. Her gallery didn't arrive serially like a Victorian novel, but in disordered, self-contained fragments. It took a few deliveries for me to sense a pattern even, and to deduce that Gloria wasn't exactly the undertaker, a role that she reserved for a reincarnation of Beatrice herself, the epitome of beauty deconstructed in a scheme to revive Ye Ugly Face Club. I am no literary critic or art historian, rather a counselor at a community center who works with youths termed disabled. Perhaps that's why Gloria entrusted me with her Galerie de Difformité. When we met, she said that she worried about everything that had become PC, political crap, she called it, from her grandmotherly mouth. Gloria herself was crippled, a bastard, and a host of other epithets that people had flung at her readily during her lifetime. In the time that remained for her, she said, she wished to dissect these terms and reassemble them into something more monstrous, but magnanimous too. In order to write this introduction, I've consulted a variety of experts to help inform my understanding of her enterprise, to give her incomplete gallery some kind of dignified public viewing. Gloria's art seems a kind of folk art, naive as it is learned. The expert that I need most is Gloria, who left no map. Since our correspondence only happened monthly, I didn't learn of her death until after some weeks passed, after her house was sold and her estate bequeathed to charity. I've never again seen that infamous bone with its heart-shaped hole. What I did find, in her local library, her name was inscribed in a book, a copy of Clarice Lispector's The Passion According to G.H. The initials match Gloria's, which may explain her fondness for this text, which begins, "This is a book just like any other book, but I would be happy if it were read only by people who know that an approach to anything whatsoever must traverse even the very opposite of what is being approached." Over time, the character G.H. came to give me, for example, a very difficult pleasure, but it is called pleasure. I believe the same might be said of Gloria Hayes and her Galerie de Difformité.
In his 18th century masterpiece of a novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, Laurence Sterne included a note. The bookbinder is desired to cover both sides of this leaf with the best marbled paper, taking care to keep the folio lines clear and to preserve the proper margins. The note was meant for a particular reader, the binder, to cover a particular page before it reached a reader. The marbled paper functioned like a skin graft transplanted on the body of the book, as shown in this early edition housed in St. John's College in Cambridge, England. Modern editions reproduce the famous marbled page, but not the binder's note, left to be found in early unfinished editions in special collections. The binder's note was more than practical. It signaled a kind of performance. Aware of the book's artifice, Sterne drew attention to different stages of book production and inherited practices of interaction. Interacting with that historic moment, the body of the book engaged different human bodies, the writer, the printer, the binder, the bookseller, the reader, and more. As a mutable medium and evolving technology, books have acquired a repertoire of analogies with the human body: header, footnotes, spine, appendix, to name a few. To some degree, books serve as metaphors for the body. Many of us in this room, as Mary already signaled, drawn to an institution like the Athenaeum, feel made up of books, not unlike this painting by Giuseppe Arcimboldo of The Librarian. To be made up of anything implies the possibility of unmaking it, which is to say that we don't really understand a thing or what we ourselves are made of until we understand the opposite and the degrees between. I often return to Clarice Lispector's words that were quoted at the end of the anti-trailer from her novel, The Passion According to G.H. This is a book, just like any other book, but I would be happy if it were read only by people who know that an approach to anything whatsoever must traverse even the very opposite of what is being approached. Among other influences, these words speak to the idea of writing the book by unwriting it, which I invite people to practice through the Galerie de Difformité. Galerie de Difformité is a novel, as poem, as essay, as art catalog that unfolds through a choose-your-own-adventure format. The novel was published in 2011 as a printed book of 250 pages of recycled paper in soft cover with color covers and black and white illustrated interior, now in its second printing, distributed by Northwestern University Press. However, the book resists traditional classifications. The project began in its earliest incarnation in 2004, and in sympathy with the composer John Cage's piece called As Slow as Possible, which is a performance occurring over 600 years, the gallery's performative dimension is emerging slowly to interface with different writing and publishing practices. Prior to the book's publication, selected pages called exhibits, which are more or less prose poems interspersed throughout the novel and labeled A through Z, were published in varied literary journals. When these copyrights reverted to me after publication, the alphabetized collection was mounted on a website as downloadable documents of plain text, akin to what Johanna Drucker has called democratic multiples, with a public call to aesthetically deform them. And you can see different stages of the project in the pictures on the slide. That verb was left open to interpretation. People downloaded the texts, deformed them, and sent them back to join the online gallery. The project is registered under Creative Commons to be able to share and shift material collaboratively. Exhibits and the gallery, what might be called pages and the book, have been decomposed into music, rolled into cigarettes, watered as a garden, melted in beeswax, mailed as postcards, and floated away on balloons. Early submissions helped to illustrate the book, layering my texts as palimpsests and pastiche. The book's outside cover and spine reproduce marbled papers with flowers from the Newberry Library's collection in Chicago, and those flowers serve to invite cross-pollination, stemming from a motif of bees that swarm through the book, including that character named Bee, as in Beatrice derived from Dante. Since marbled papers traditionally lined interior covers, this exterior marbling suggests that the book was turned inside out. The interior marbles also come from the Newberry, but from a collection of discarded marbles whose original books are unknown, so I wanted to give one a home in a new book. Galerie de Difformité includes visual quotations like these and interactive cues ranging from historic manicules or pointing hands to quick response or QR codes, which can be scanned with mobile devices to augment the reading experience, leading to varied offshoots within the online gallery. The book continually grows in and out of itself, questioning and expanding conceptions of deformity, book, gallery, among other words as material texts. One of the book's opening pages includes Sterne's bookbinder's note as a direct quote, asking readers to adopt the role of binder, paradoxically as the book requests to be unbound. As the project networks print and digital practices, it resists staying static, growing slowly and in stutters. Akin to a living organism, the Galerie de Difformité continues to grow as communities adopt the project with crowdsourced deformations, short films, pop-up exhibits and group exhibitions, an electronic library of collaborative chapbooks, some of which are floating around on the handouts, conference presentations, critical articles exploring different aspects of the project, and pedagogical materials at almost 20 colleges and universities across disciplines, including a semester-long course called the Galerie de Difformité, a British literature seminar that occurred at the University of North Florida this past fall. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Julia Penko, who is here tonight. She's at MIT and taught the book as part of her digital literature course this past fall, and will teach it again this fall at Weber State University out in Utah. And she's also written about the project for Sharp and ALA. As the Galerie de Difformité continues to deform, I hope to redesign the online platform where the book recedes behind conversations around it as a microcosm of larger trends that are reshaping critical and creative discourses bridged to their histories. Returning to the book, Henry James famously critiqued the genre of the novel as a baggy monster, and the copyright page for the Galerie de Difformité claims this capacious classification. As the Gallery's directives start to multiply, readers, who are called subscribers, referring to an early production method not unlike print on demand, can choose to follow varied plotlines, epistles, soliloquy-like sonnets, poetic and prose exhibits, etymologic remixes and deformances, among other matters, bumping up against warnings about a monster hidden in the book. And any of you who know Grover know my literary allusion there in Sesame Street. Rereading never yields the same root, even when returning to the same page, since its context changes through alterations and detours through different genres, periods, disciplines, and points of view. The text barks cautionary notes, warns readers to break and remake rules for reading, and to question interactions with the book down to the elemental act of turning a page. As references to deformed pile up historic and aesthetic contexts, the word's negative legacy trails behind characters. Reaching back to antiquity, Aristotle wrote that women were deformed males. In his groundbreaking 18th century dictionary, Samuel Johnson defined deformity and ugliness interchangeably, closely connected with disability and ridicule. The surname of the Gallery's fictional protagonist of Gloria Hayes echoes William Hay, an 18th century member of British Parliament and hunchback who wrote one of the first disability memoirs in 1754 entitled Deformity, an Essay. Hay's rhetorical strategies undermined established binaries of the time to enable the possibility of being considered both morally upright and physically crooked. In the Galerie de Difformité, as deformed references remix, the mashed-up recollection aims, to borrow the words of Gloria Hayes, to dissect these terms and reassemble them into something more monstrous, but magnanimous too. As the novel performs its simultaneous bookness and bodiness, it wiggles and writhes within and outside these bounds. Analogizing itself to a deforming body and book, the novel includes a club of ugly faces, which was an actual historic trend, a degradable spine, hundreds of manicules, a single footnote, 28 pages of electronic endnotes called buttnotes, an appendix that was removed by emergency appendectomy, among other anthropomorphic references. Subscribers are asked to perform actual and hypothetical identity categorizations while dissecting the book's parts to unpack historic discourses about the body, tangled with different classifications, while searching for that shape-shifting monster that is continually redefined based on the shifting subjectivity of any reader. To some degree, the monster lies in the eyes of the beholder, also calling attention to the limits of sight. Masquerading as a funhouse of warped mirrors, Galerie de Difformité reflects distortions, less of bodies than of perceptions of whoever enters. Different reading strategies arise around bodies in life and in art, even around similarly shaped bodies. Disability studies scholar Leonard Davis has described this disconnect as revealing more about the observer than the observed by comparing the Venus de Milo, whose stump arms often go unnoticed under her aura of classical art, and the Irish performance artist, Mary Duffy, who was born without arms and who imitates the Venus while talking back to spectators to confront their expectations. The problem of narrative itself harks back to antiquity, to what David Mitchell calls narrative prostheses, or the notion that all narratives operate out of a desire to compensate for a limitation or to rein in excessiveness. As both a book and a body, the gallery invites and even demands its own literacy, as it paradoxically seems limited and excessive. It troubles diagnosis. What is wrong with this book, body? The question itself becomes troubling. What is a normal book body? The active reading becomes more active than passive, as readers may embrace the book with its technological tentacles or throw it down in frustration. And here, a quick return back to Tristram Shandy and Sterne's marbled page with its facing text that reads, "You had better throw down the book at once, for without much reading, by which your reverence knows I mean much knowledge, you will no more be able to penetrate the moral of my next marbled page, motley emblem of my work." Turning a page of the gallery proves tantamount to breaking not only rules, but also paradoxically, potentially, the book's spine. As readers are asked to deform inherited reading strategies, expectations for reading books and bodies haunt the experience, implicating us in our choices to reinforce or rewrite meanings. The guide that haunts the book is the so-called deformed reincarnation of Dante's Beatrice, whose representation across history already has been deformed again and again in the eyes of her beholders. And you'll probably recognize among these varied representations on this slide artwork by Holcomb, Rossetti, Blake, Solomon, Burke, Phillips, Rauschenberg, Dali, and Beatrice changes from a cherubic Cupid to a sensuous woman to a nursemaid to an angel with a hole in her center to a woman contemplating McDonald's sign to an abstraction. While appearing as an inanimate book, Galerie de Difformité performs its unruly body, pushing against postmodern theories about the death of the author and the death of the reader. When readers have asked for my signature rather than sign my name, I stamp the book with my thumbprint in red ink, akin to rubrication or blood, leaving the imprint of my touch and even my DNA on page 103, where a printed instruction asks the reader to caricature themselves. The book's dedication reads, "Why you, of course." If someone engages only with the surface of the story, they will close it after a few pages, or on the flip side, destroy the book. But if they read deeper, the narrow concept of deformity starts to complicate and blur. The word expands and reveals aesthetic dimensions of form, literally embedded in the word deformity, tied to ourselves along with lineages of unmaking and undoing, like sand paintings of mandalas, or natural processes of deformation, like seasonal change, and sociocultural roots connected with almost any historically marginal group, as I've already touched on. Rather than use a benign word like form, as in the gallery of forms, I'm interested in whether a word associated with social exclusion, that is, deformity, can be deformed through aesthetic inclusion. With that in mind, I'd like to read a few student responses to the project, and this slide shows a few snapshots from different professors and student blogs at the University of North Florida, Pasadena City College, and Temple University, where you can see on the far right a student tweeted while reading the books upside down, because you don't always read the book in the right direction, or the quote-unquote right direction. At the University of North Florida, a student in Professor Chris Gabbard's course that was called the Galerie de Difformité, the British Literature Seminar, deformed the book into a short film, and a small part of her response described her project thus: "The still shots first show a book we read, followed by the word I chose from that book. I used a child's mobile to illustrate the power that words have over the human conscience. From a distance, the soothing music coming from the revolving mobile shows something that's innocent and relatively, quote-unquote, normal. Up close, the words of deformity distort the image of an innocent mobile and shift its appearance to something more haunting. I wanted to deform the words from the books to show that individual words do not affect anything, but as the words build on each other, they do start changing a person's observation. As soon as society labels someone or something as deformed, no one can move beyond that description. At Pasadena City College, Professor Kirsten Ogden taught the book and asked students, "What did dealing with this text do to you?" One of her students made a video vine and wrote, "My individual contribution to the project is creating an artistic representation by using a flower that creates a ripple effect when it makes contact with the watery surface. At the rate we're going now, there's no question that our earth will be destroyed by our actions, not only by consciously doing things to add more fire to the fuel, but also acting passively and not trying to prevent destruction from further happening. The earth is like our body, which keeps us alive and allows us to continue to live." Another of Professor Ogden's students recorded on her project blog, "Even though I don't understand some pages, this whole book is up to your own interpretation, problems, happiness, etc. It's a gateway to your own self. Page 194 demonstrates this best. It asks you to identify your monster. I interpreted this as the thing we fear most in our lives. First, we must seek within ourselves this monster. Then, by leaving a blank space, the book forces you to acknowledge the monster. It helps you discover your fear in the sense that while you still have not found the solution, the identification helps you face it. After deforming page 194, I answered my own question. I love the moment that a child understands or learns something new. Even if I can't find the solution to my life's problems right at this moment, the book helps me picture the problems so that I can know where to look for the answers." As a method of declassification, Galerie de Difformité packages itself as a book while troubling contemporary categorizations also around this artifact/technology. Readers have reported finding the book in varied bookstore sections: art, literature, fiction, poetry, criticism, and to my surprise, nonfiction. I've started to collect some of these found artifacts, including listserv queries from librarians who have publicly asked how to catalog the book, to public installations and interventions, to documentations of technological default messages. One subscriber's deformation that was archived in Exhibit B played as a video on YouTube for 2 years and then was removed. So it now plays a default message that quote unquote no longer exists, an unintended juxtaposition with the video's title of language. Even back when the book was being constructed, it resisted representation. I wrote and designed the book using Microsoft Word and photo elements, and when the time came to transfer the manuscript to the publisher, this format proved problematic since my entire layout would drop out in InDesign. The most efficient solution ended up being to save each page as an individual PDF akin to an antiquated page plate, so the designer needed to only add page numbers on the bottom of my plates. Inadvertently, this process resembled a printing practice called stereotyping, creating a solid plate of type to print entire pages laid out in reverse, and you can see on the slide how this functions. Since my text was printed digitally, my page plates acted more as reverse stereotypes. The double meaning resonates with the novel's themes. Long before video games and interactive media, printed books provided a medium for readers to interact through marginalia, memorization, hand-drawn manicules, dog-earing, bookmarking, Grangerizing, wear and tear, among other processes, and these find contemporary analogs in different ways. One of the inspirations was an 1847 room in London called the Destruction Room, an extra illustrative entity. And I'll explain a little bit about this. The book actually has a destruction room as part of it, and this is really where the invitation for participation comes. The Destruction Room, a room full of interesting books, or at least when cut up will be so, as far as regards the places they refer to, and quietly waiting an opportunity to be changed from generals to particulars. And there's an illustration of a woman kind of from an old housekeeping magazine. She's got a very large pair of scissors, and she's in front of a sewing machine, and the text on the bottom reads, "During dressmaking time, good shears." And then there's a footnote. You are here, the only footnote in this entire Galerie de Difformité. Not a hand note nor butt note, there are many of those, but the soul and heel of this exhibitional enterprise. Being the only footnote, a responsibility is borne by what it foots, the destruction room that revives an extra illustrative entity invented by Frederick Strong when he advertised himself as neither a book or print seller, but one who sold printed ephemera, all dated, cut up, and arranged according to his own classification system. In short, Lucy Peltz writes in Facing the Text, Strong had gone into book breaking. But Strong is dead, and I am not, guiding you now by reviving a gentlewoman named B for lack of a better nom de plume. Minding P's and Q's, you found me middling while mending. During dressmaking time, good shears. Facing the text, I wouldn't call myself a breaker so much as a seamstress, enlisting your help to tailor this book around a budding body, the once and future corpse of this corpus. To survive, I need your help to evolve, to deform and reform, to dream and metamorphose, or otherwise risk misreading me and B. Open sesame. During dressmaking time, good shears. Snip, snip, snip. Or start by sketching manicules in margins, or merely manifest a set of hypothetical instructions. How to build, operate, repair, maintain, recycle materials, paper, stitching, board, letters, etc. How to deform this book. And then there's a list. 1, make hundreds of paper dolls. 2, make dozens of paper dresses for dozens of paper dolls. 3, forget the dolls and stitch all the pages into one life-size dress. 4, forget the dress and fly origami cranes. 5, or fold a flock of variably shaped planes, ideally enlisting a high school physics class. 6, wallpaper. 7, paper mache sculpture. 8, installation art with mounds of crumpled paper. 9, performance art, shearing and shredding and reconstructing. 10, or otherwise demonstrate in performative fashion any of the above or next instructions. 11, shred pages to fill a dream pillow. 12, cut confetti and celebrate whatever occasion. 13, make ghost prints or something palimpsestual. 14, use each page as a canvas, painting over text and leaving words exposed, yielding a new narrative. 15, cut into pieces for scrapbooking, bricolage, collage, etc. 16, scatter scraps near nest-building birds. 17, no book burning, although Exhibit J may suggest otherwise. 18, shuffle extant pages, add new exhibits, whatever your heart desires. When you've deformed the Galerie de Difformité, please contact me at deformity@gmail.com, and that's DIFFORMITE, to document your process with the expectation of my curating an exhibit from this collective enterprise. A virtual prototype can be found at deformity.wordpress.com. Among other commitments, my practice of unwriting the book through deformity has encouraged me to follow the material through different disciplines, leading my research and teaching beyond literature and creative writing into art history, book history, museum studies, disability studies, medical humanities, and other disciplines. My courses at MIT included writing in the museum and unwriting the book. And I believe she's here because she emailed me today. I'm thrilled to have one of my graduate students from that latter class G. Chi, here with her variation on hacking the book. And you can see a hacked book that she's done up in the slide. For this hacked book that she's working on for the gallery, she plans to add muscle wire to help it move as a kind of body. And there are lots of things that she does to electrify and circuit books so they light up and move and do wonderful things. Other constraints are built into the longevity of the project and will be shaped by future participation and adaptation, without which the book will essentially die. Even if it survives only as a ghost story, the specter of deformité may continue to haunt as we seek ways to read and treat bodies more magnanimously, socially, aesthetically, and otherwise. There are other aspects of the project, but I'd really love to open this up to questions. So in closing, I'll just add, as future deformations aggregate in a hopefully more capacious platform to better represent this range of activities and questions circling around one another, I hope that the Galerie de Difformité will engage more artists, students, and a range of participants alongside interdisciplinary self-critique to suggest unanticipated intersections and productive tensions across writing, art, scholarship, pedagogy, and more. There is culpability in performing deformation, and I hope to encourage leaping into that trap to make transparent its implications alongside adaptive strategies for reading and dialoguing, for reflective process over instant product. Writing in 1992 about the as-of-yet unpublished postmodern novel The Tunnel by William Gass, John Unsworth, who's now at Brandeis, said that Gass's project could be characterized as a work in progress in the sense that a painting might be called a work in oils. Unsworth wrote, "As long as the tunnel remains in progress, the possibility that the text will change undermines the authority of traditional literary criticism, which aims at definitive assessments of finished products. If what we are reading is process rather than a product, our reading must be at least as conditional as is the writing." His words echo my hope for the Galerie de Difformité. Can declassifications change how we read objects and subjects, including one another? What is deformity, and can its definition change through collaboration and aesthetics? Where lies authority and inaccessibility in this process? How do we unread, unwrite, unmake meanings, not only individually, but also communally? While the Galerie de Difformité exists as a book that we can grasp in our hands, its scope defies its bounds, inviting readers to participate in its unfinished story that may continue to grow in and out of a changing world where deformity is all around us, where we are deforming. I invite you to participate in this process by deforming the book. Thank you. And I'd love to open this up to questions. Yes?
I am very interested in this last point, second last point about unreading. And you're reminding me a bit of the research of Peter Sallygrass.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So the letters and the kind of recent work he's been doing on letters and also on paintings that show how things were read throughout the millennia and how things are, how those kind of processes are based on clearly very contemporary observations on old processes that can't, idiosyncratically are being reinterpreted. And so I'm wondering, with these kinds of deformities, obviously some of them are very hard to read, and so I'm wondering, or at least to read in a traditional sense.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you could make a comment on that in terms of, are these, what sort of reading, or is it really just unreading, is going to happen with this kind of, in a gallery like this?
Yes, no, that's a great question. I also want to flip to my last slide just because there are so many people to thank. I just want to begin and end with all of the thanks. No, and I'm curious in some ways when you put the question back to me about in unreading deformities, what you're referring to. Are you referring to what I'm calling deformities in the book, or what people are sending me in the site, or what is historically labeled as deformities, just so I can understand your question, or all of the above?
I hadn't really thought it through, so I suppose I meant it as all of you. For the sake of time, if you want to pick one.
Sure. Well, no, I actually am intentionally fusing them because I think there is, again, in putting up the example of the Venus de Milo and the Mary Duffy, all of a sudden there's something visual. A lot of times with art, we forget our other senses in inhabiting these various worlds, but something that can be very starkly seen very quickly. And it also, to show it on a slide, we don't have Mary Duffy talking back. So it's in some ways a disadvantage to put those two images side by side and have them be silent. But in trying to take our extrapolation of reading, say, deformed bodies, and then try to put that on a book, or vice versa, take our reading strategies for a book and then put them on bodies, or again, artworks, letters, all of the other different kind of ways, it becomes a way of confusing ourselves because we've inherited things. I think that's what's also lovely when I've talked with students who are reading the book and they have such a difficult time of breaking the rules, because it does have, the choose your own adventure. It's a lovely children's device, for children's literature, and you jump around to these various pages. But here, you're scolded. There are cautionary notes, and it says, you've done a really bad thing. And so all of a sudden, the impetus, we have to question how we're actually engaging this, because we pick up these books and the expectation is we read them from left to right, unless it's Hebrew. I mean, there are different kind of inherited practices culturally, and even the book as an object we think of as an inert thing, but in some ways, in alluding to all of these various parts of book history, it's saying the book was never necessarily exactly the way we think it is. There's kind of a phantom book or book that we sometimes romanticize, but it's changed in really interesting ways. So a lot of it comes back to that, our own ability to question, where are we inheriting these things from? Some of them obviously stay stable. They're time-worn practice. There are lots of parts of the books that have stuck because they've worked. And there are a variety of different social apparatuses that have worked, but there are a lot that have not worked. So part of it is blurring that boundary. Thanks for the question. Yes?
Did your research have any consideration of the period when William Burroughs did the...
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Thank you. That's a great question, and a kind of third mind. You know Burroughs well. So, and there's so much 20th century. I mean, this is very much a postmodern book. I didn't even refer to another main character in the book, who's Gretchen Henderson. So I put a fictional version of myself for anyone who, my name is Gretchen Henderson. But so, and even Gloria Hayes, there is an intentional use of the GH there, and kind of this diminishing mirrors. But there are many, many postmodern devices that I'm in conversation with that come out of all of these practitioners across both fiction writing but poetics. The poetics often perform the page in really wonderful visual ways and are pushing against kind of margins, or even going back to Mallarmé's poetry that works over the white space as a kind of silence. And my background is actually as a musician, so I also think of the book as a performative space, even though it's a silent reading act. What kind of comes through, what are ways to activate the reading performance? So, thank you. Yes?
I'm not sure I quite get all of what you're presenting, but from what I gather, you're asking us to redefine our definition of a book, since the book once upon a time was scrolls, and then the church, as I understand it, began to put them between pieces of paper. Now we have books, e-books, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like it's still the idea of a literature preserved in different formats, and the book is both the content and the format, and if I understand, you're trying to suggest that a new format could lead to a new definition of a book.
Yeah, and there are many, many people doing this. I mean, this is in conversation with so many different influences, and there, I think we're at that moment where we've definitely inherited a certain notion of the book, but our sense of information and storage and portability, some of the things that you mentioned, in kind of taking the codex and moving it to kind of its next stage. Ebooks really aren't, they're just, you talked about them as just being preserving text. I think you might have used that word. And so, but they're not necessarily doing something with the form. To read Tristram Shandy, for instance, something that when you see it in the special collections in its multiple volumes, it's a very different reading experience than reading Tristram Shandy on an ebook. Or even one of the kind of my pet projects whenever I visit a special collections is to ask for an edition of Tristram Shandy that they have, because that marbled page really is a signal to what the changing technology is. At the beginning, it made each volume unique because you couldn't actually reproduce the marble. But now, something like the Penguin edition, it's just this black and white photocopy. So it's a lost and found process.
Well, this interests me because it sort of builds on Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message, that what a person says in oratory is the least important than the appearance of whether he sounds as though he's knowing something. He could be saying complete nonsense and still get elected to public office, of course, which that would never happen here. But an example, to use Bart Ehrman's example, many of the
And I think those are inviting acts of translation. I think that's kind of what I'm interested in, and what gets lost and found in each of these translations. And the medium does deliver the message when we are reading something again on an ebook versus a book versus something else. But it creates a kind of fertile space for experimentation. I mean, cultural experimentation, cultural change. So there's not, I don't have an answer to this because obviously everyone is chasing this in different ways, but it's very interesting to make transparent some of that history, like some of the examples you've alluded to. Thank you.
Yes, is the text in your work fixed, or are the deformities open to sort of the Wikipedia model where the participants could alter the story?
This is actually one of the reasons I want to redesign the site, because it's a big fault. I had set it up in a WordPress platform. I've tried to really just use free technologies to be able to model what, again, when working with classes, it's very important to be able to cross a lot of different kind of classes and socioeconomic backgrounds. So any free platform. But I found immediately that actually became very limiting. So right now it works that someone will send it to me at this address, which also, again, is part of, I want to know that they allow the changing. So it's part of the Creative Commons part, that they're in some ways offering their deformation to the project. But I know that in a variety of the classes, when people have done it, even one of those slides, I think one of the slides had the student blog that was actually using Wikipedia. So the students are working in student groups where they're deforming things using some of the more open platforms. So, but that's something that, again, it's a long-term project just because my time ends up being a little limited, so I'm a little slow sometimes in pushing it forward. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Yes, Augusta.
It's just very striking when you talk about the project, how much pleasure you get out of it, and how grateful you are and encouraging other people's playfulness.
Thank you.
How do you think about the reader who isn't enjoying it?
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about that. I wondered if you could sort of maybe fill that out a little bit more.
Absolutely. No, and that's in some ways also in trying to draw attention to that. Again, the Tristram Shandy, the throw down the book. There, I think a number of people who would come to this and say, this is not my idea of literature. If you haven't seen the book, I can pass it around, but it's illustrated, but it's got some crumpled epistles. It's got sonnet cycle that run through it. There are lots of, the kind of Burroughsy, the poetic play. There's erasures, there's cutout, there's archival material, and then there are loads and loads and loads of the choose your own adventure directives. So there, and some of them lead to dead ends. And then the QR codes, it doesn't necessarily, you may not know what a QR code, so you don't know what these barcode, they look like little black and white barcodes. And some people have met the project only through the website, not knowing there's a book, thinking it's kind of a phantom object. And some people meet the book and they don't necessarily know that there's a website that goes along with it. So there are these kind of literacies that go along with it. And that's also in part of, and I didn't talk about this as much, but there is a part of the book that that says how to make this book more inaccessible. And so part of it is also trying to draw attention to kind of notions of access in whether it's books, whether it's architecture, whether it's environments, who has access to this material, because there are a lot of things that many people don't have access to. So I am in some ways deliberately making a frustrating experience, I guess. I'm hoping that people meet it with the same kind of playfulness or stick with it enough to kind of see that, oh wait, if I actually start interacting with the book, then I get something out of it. When people treat it as a precious object and don't interact with it, that I think becomes the limiting thing. So it's kind of pushing beyond our own comfort zones. Thank you. Yes, Marie.
Since this is a moving target, what was your original assumption, and are you in a different place than you thought you would be? And if this is going to kind of go along with kind of monitor, which I assume is what you'll do, is there another project that you're working on or starting?
There are many projects always cross-fertilizing, yes. No, when I started it, I mean, it's been a project that surprised me to no end along the way. It actually started as a critical essay that was supposed to just be a critical essay that didn't want to be a critical essay. It was in 18th century, I was looking at that period, and the word deformity kept coming up in visual culture when I was looking at art and architecture and poetics, and it just kind of lent itself to be an interlinked collection of kind of micro essays with the image and caption of the work that I happened to be explicating at the time. And afterwards, it kind of haunted me. There was something in that fractured structure that almost the white space wanted something breathing between. And since I was also a fiction writer, then there were different narratives that started suggesting themselves, and questions in reading across periods, medieval period, 18th century, 20th century, there was kind of this question, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if these different periods could actually talk to one another? They have such interesting language, even when we're just looking at English. It's fascinating to kind of see that language change both in our ears, reading aloud. I loved reading Middle English, where I wasn't taught it, but I would start reading it aloud and the words would start clicking in my ears even though I wasn't recognizing the spelling on the page. So that was partially in using Beatrice as the guide. She came as an early character, and then kind of the larger architecture of the novel. But then since it was constantly deforming, I thought, well, in form and content playing off one another, even going back to your point about the kind of a book that's just put in an e-platform. I'm really interested in that question of form and content always growing in and out of one another. So if it was going to be a gallery of deformity, it had to deform. And so that was when the kind of, okay, I have to open this up to a kind of, and my definition of deformity, even studying it, I know there are many, many other definitions that other people carry. It'd be better to just let this be a public project. And I didn't expect, it's a little grassroots project. I don't do much promotion, and it's, small. So it's been wonderful when these different communities have adopted it, or different exhibitions, the kind of pop-up exhibitions that have happened, or the pedagogy that's beautiful pedagogy that's kind of coming out of it. So I'm hoping that there will be more bridges between these various communities. And so I see myself as more of a facilitator as the project goes on, and thinking how to do that on very little funding too. So that's kind of, but then in response to your other question, I'm working on a cultural history of ugliness that also grew out of this project. The Ugly Face Club that I mentioned, I ended up writing a scholarly article on that was not deformed. It was just and that was published in an art history anthology, and then was approached by an editor to write a cultural history of ugliness. I never saw myself working with all of this rhetoric. And then also I'd like to give a shout out to Elena Ruhr in the room. She's a composer over on the faculty at MIT, and we're writing an opera together that if anyone's around in November, an unstaged performance is happening at MIT. It's called Cassandra and the Temples, and it's a vocal chamber opera for the ensemble Room Full of Teeth, which is in New York, an amazing sound. They just won a Grammy. So it's been, kind of we're always crossing different disciplinary lines and also genre and artistic lines. Any other questions? Oh, right. That's a nice way to end. Thank you so much for coming.